at the Observatory of Nationalism and Populism. We have the pleasure to welcome here today Professor Cas Mudde from University of Georgia. Professor Mudde has kindly agreed to offer us this talk for free, so we appreciate this very much. It's one of the few talks that he offers to institutions worldwide. Professor Mudde, is nothing but perhaps the major authority on the far right and populism in general nowadays, which is pretty much in line with what we study here at our observatory that is based at the Armando Álvares Penteado Foundation, and more specifically at our bachelor's in international relations. We started our activities this year, and we host from time to time public talks on nationalism, populism, particularly the right-wing populism that has swept around the world and that causes lots of impact on politics, but also on the economy, even companies, the arts, all fields that we cover here in the courses that we offer at FAAP. So without further ado, I would like to thank again Professor Mudde for his kindness, and we shall start the presentation. He may talk for around 30 minutes, half an hour, and please send your questions on YouTube, and we'll try to select the most relevant ones by the end of the talk, when Professor Mudde may answer the questions for about 20 minutes. Okay, so thank you very much again, and the floor is yours, Professor Mudde.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to do this. What I will do today is give a short overview of some of the key points of one of my last books, The Far Right Today, which was a global view, although undoubtedly slightly Eurocentric. And then at the end, I want to put Brazil in this broader context, and just to make it absolutely clear, I'm not an expert on Brazil or on Bolsonaro. I look at the country and at him through the global lens of the far right. So without further ado, this is roughly what I'm going to do. Incidentally, this is a PDF and it has changed the letter type, and so I think that certain slides might be a little bit messed up later. Anyway, I'm first going to argue that we're in the fourth wave of post-war far right. This is a chronology that is mostly based on Western Europe, but I would argue that the characteristics of the fourth wave are global. And so the fourth wave is characterized by the extreme heterogeneity of the far right, the increasingly complex role of gender. I would also argue the increasingly central role of gender and sexuality, the mainstreaming of the far right, the normalization of the far right, and the shifting boundaries between the mainstream and the far right. And so at the end, I will look at the case of Brazil, mostly Bolsonaro, and argue that Brazil is both typical and atypical. In many ways, they follow these key characteristics of the fourth wave, but there are some very special elements to it, even unique elements to it, and I will reflect a bit on that. So I don't want to say too much about terminology, but it is important that we understand how I use the terms. So I use left and right, not in the socioeconomic interpretation, but actually in the interpretation of the Italian political philosopher Norberto Bobbio, who distinguished between left-wing and right-wing ideologies on the basis of their position on egalitarianism. And so very simply stated, the right, broadly defined, considers inequalities in society as natural and argues that they should be outside of the purview of the state, which means that either these inequalities are good, as, for example, many conservatives or elitists would argue, or that it is up to the state, up to the market to take care of it, as like the most narrow sense neoliberals would argue. Now, the far right includes the extreme and the radical right. And so what we generally call the mainstream right, which really is the liberal democratic right, is outside of that. The extreme right is anti-democratic in the core, which means that they don't support popular sovereignty and majority rule, which means that the extreme right does not believe that people should elect their own leaders. And of course, the best example here is traditional fascism, National Socialism, which didn't believe in democracy, which believed that their leader, who was superior not just to other nations or races, but was also superior to other people within the own people, within the own nation, should lead. Now, the radical right actually accepts democracy in the narrow sense. It does believe that the people should elect their own leaders, but it has problems with what we generally call liberal democracy, mostly aspects that limit the power of the executive, such as rule of law, separation of powers, and minority rights. Now, when I talk about minority rights, I'm not talking about ethnic minority rights or religious, but political minorities. On average, the vast majority of the relevant, powerful far-right actors are radical right. The extreme right tends to be still relatively small, but as I will argue, we are seeing a radicalization of certain radical right actors, which means that certain quite relevant actors are kind of in between the radical right and the extreme right at this point in time. So it was actually Klaus von Beime, a German political scientist who sadly died just a few days ago, who wrote a very influential article in 1988 where he distinguished three waves of post-war, what he called right-wing extremism in Western Europe. And the first wave was that of post-fascism, which really was just the remnants of the fascist era, often mid-level fascist functionaries and politicians who organized mostly outside of the electoral arena, in part because they were often in the first post-war years banned. There was only really one party that you could see as a post-fascist party that was successful, and that was the Italian social movement. Now, post-fascism was largely backward-looking. It's also sometimes called neo-fascism, but there wasn't much neo about it. It was really just the old ideology, often a little bit moderated because of legal restrictions. The second wave that he distinguished, he called right-wing populism, and it was very diverse and a bit amorphous. And it existed largely out of so-called flash parties, parties that came out of nowhere, would have one election with big success, and then often either disappeared or had another election with little success and then disappeared. They were right-wing, often in terms of conservatism, traditional values, not so much with regard to nativism, because immigration wasn't a major issue in most cases, but they were strongly populist. And the picture here is of Pierre Puigdemont, who was the leader of a party that in the late 1950s won 13.5% out of nowhere and then disappeared. And Puigdemont has had a major legacy on how we think about populism. In fact, the term Puigdemont is almost used as a synonym for populism. And then the third wave that he spoke about was that of what I've called the populist radical right, which really emerged in the 1980s but became more relevant in the 1990s. And this was with parties like the Front National, the Austrian Freedom Party, several other parties that still exist today. Now, I would argue that the third wave was mostly defined in a relational terms, in terms of the electoral and political breakthrough of the radical right. Radical right parties were seen as new, as outsiders, and as challengers. They weren't part of the mainstream, they were challenging the mainstream. And my contention is that this wave ended roughly at the turn of the century and gave way to the fourth wave, which is qualitatively and quantitatively different. So first of all, it is defined by extreme heterogeneity, not just in the sense of extreme right versus radical right, but also in organizational form, in success, in size and scope. So as I will argue later, like Bolsonaro is one extreme of a far-right leader without a far-right party. Then you have the Party for Freedom of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, which is a far-right leader with a far-right party which only has one member, him. And then you have a party like the BJP in India, which is allegedly the largest party in the world with 100 million members. Right? So even in just pure structure and looking only at political parties, you see this huge variety. Of course, you have parties like Fidesz in Hungary that win almost 50% of the vote, and you have parties that win less than 1% of the vote. You have parties that are 50 years old, you have parties that are 3 years old. So it's incredible variety, not just ideologically, but in virtually all terms. Within the non-party social movement type far right, we also see a lot of differences. On the one hand, you have the alt-right, which here's the picture of Charlottesville, which is largely an online movement, highly diverse, and only partly related to existing far-right organizations. Then you have the RSS, which is really the mother organization of the BJP in India. As you can see, it's a uniformed, almost paramilitary unit of tens of millions of people that will organize like massive demonstrations in the streets. And then you have organizations like Pegida in Germany that are kind of single issue anti-Islam movements that often actually attract people from the far right as well as people from mainstream conservatism. So again, in terms of what they stand for, how they organize, how they relate to the far right proper, huge diversity. And then even in the terms of terrorism, violence, we have a lot of different forms. We have the so-called lone wolf, like Anders Breivik in Norway. Now, lone wolf is a highly contested term. I prefer single actor. And so these are people who act by themselves, but often are connected to a broader intellectual movement, at least online. Then we have smaller, almost subcultures, like the Hilltop Youth, which are settler youth, very extreme right settler youth in the West Bank who terrorize Palestinians there. And you have growing, kind of very tightly organized, real terrorist cells that often are neo-Nazi. And there is increasing worry that they might be related to particularly conflicts like Ukraine. So when you talk about the far right, you talk about a lot of different things. And I think it's important that we understand that, and probably most of us are better off focusing primarily on one of these forms. And so I personally am far more someone who studies political parties than, for example, terrorism. Well, this was exactly what I worried about, but this was supposed to give an overview of the success of far-right parties in the EU. The key point to take away from this is, first of all, it really ranges from like in the 40% to less than 3%. You have countries where the majority of the population vote for far-right parties, which are both in government and in opposition, like Hungary and Poland. And you have countries like Ireland, where no one votes for the far right. So even if we talk about a fourth wave, it doesn't mean that the far right is a major player in every European country or in every democracy. It is in a majority of European countries, but even then, in some they are the hegemonic party, and in others they are one of the most important opposition parties. Important point, the far right is global. We see Trump, we see Bolsonaro, North and South America. We see both Modi and Netanyahu in different parts of Asia. There's a far right, at the very least, in South Africa, and then, of course, both parts of Europe. Now, I think what is important here to note is that I focus specifically on the far right in which nativism plays a major role. And so there are arguments to be made that certain religious fundamentalist movements are far right, or certain monarchist movements are. I'm not taking a particular position on that. I focus specifically on parties in which nativism plays a major role, or actors. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important and not studied well is the relationship between far right and gender. And it's important to make a distinction here between sex and gender. I think the first time I ever wrote about this, which was in my 2007 book, I really just wrote about sex. I looked at women in the far right parties and how they were represented. I think actually what is perhaps far more interesting is to look at masculinity and femininity. So traditionally, implicitly, the far right was just seen as a male and masculine phenomenon. If we thought about the far right, we thought about people like Jean-Marie Le Pen or Bolsonaro. Like, those are the stereotypical kind of brutal, traditional manly men with a kind of a military authoritarian background who are boorish and sexist, etc., etc. But actually, that's only part of the far right today. There are more and more women who are in leadership positions, and there are more and more male leaders who are not traditionally masculine. Someone like Tom van Grieken or Jimmy Åkesson in respectively Belgium and Sweden are men who look kind of like eternal students or ideal son-in-laws, who abhor violence, and who in many ways like don't fit the stereotypical idea of masculinity. We also see a shift in the sexism. So traditionally the far right had kind of the same sexism as conservatism, which we call in the literature benevolent sexism. And in benevolent sexism, you see men as physically strong and dominant, and women as weak. And you have different roles. Like, women are seen as more pure than men, who are driven by lust and anger and emotions. And that is why women have kind of power within the family, particularly with regard to children. And it's the role of men to protect women, particularly protect them from men outside of their nation, which traditionally within the Western world have been black men and increasingly Muslim men. Now, as Islamophobia has become the key prejudice in most far-right parties, not just in Europe, also in India and in Israel and in the US, what we see within certain far-right parties, particularly more in the north of Europe, is so-called femo-nationalism, which means that the far-right will defend gender equality, but only in the context of an alleged threat from Islam. And so the idea is pretty much we have achieved gender equality. That's part of our national culture. And it is threatened by Islam and immigrants. More specifically, it's only threatened by them. And so what you then see is radical right parties in the Netherlands, for example, they will vote for things that have to do with gender equality if it is placed in the context of immigration and integration. If it is not, for example, the threat to gender equality comes from Christian fundamentalism, then they will not vote for it. So it's a very instrumental use of gender equality. And you see exactly the same with so-called homo-nationalism, where gay rights are being embraced, but only in that context. Now, obviously, as you know, in Brazil, this doesn't apply to all far-right leaders. It really is a reflection that for most of the far right, these issues are kind of secondary. And the far right is influenced by general culture. So in countries like Sweden or the Netherlands, where almost 100% of the population supports gender equality and gay rights, it makes no sense electorally, like to go against that. And you see that even in France, where a majority stands for gay rights, and Marine Le Pen has changed that. But in many southern countries, both in the Americas and in Europe, right, where homophobia is still broadly shared and widespread, the far right is still deeply homophobic, and I will talk a little bit more about that. Finally, what you see with particularly this new so-called alt-right is a new form of sexism, which is sometimes called misogyny or toxic misogyny, where women are no longer seen as weak, but actually as strong. The idea is that women have power over men because of sexuality. The idea is that women have no sexual desires, and men are almost driven by their sexual desires, which creates a power differential. Right? And so women can withhold sex from men and thereby control them. On top of that, women have power because of political correctness. And so whenever anything is criticized, they will just pull the gender card and allegedly everything stops. Now, leaving aside how bizarre that is, it has one very important consequence, namely that it makes women a legitimate target in politics. So in benevolent sexism, it is beneath a man to be violent towards women because women are weak. In this misogynistic view that is strong online and on the alt-right, women are strong and therefore legitimate targets. And what we then see is actually women being targeted, not just verbally, but also physically. And we have seen several so-called incel attacks. Incels are involuntary celibates, so pretty much men who can't get sex. And they have targeted specifically women they didn't know, right? Because the idea is, well, women have power. With regard to the mainstreaming, I want to be reasonably short. The idea is that particularly since 9/11, social cultural issues have become dominant in the political discourse. And we have seen a mainstreaming of the issues, the frames, and the positions of the far right. And we see this in particular with regard to immigration. So by and large, in the third wave, 1980s, 1990s, the far right was the only one who argued that immigration is a problem, that immigration is a threat to national identity and to national security. In the wake of 9/11 and then boosted by the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, this has become a majority position, which is defended by the mainstream right and many within the mainstream left as well. Like, immigration is a problem, multiculturalism has failed, all positions that until recently were exclusive to the far right. And we can see how the differences between the traditional mainstream right and the traditional and the far right have blurred. And so in the 1980s, 1990s, there was a difference between the UMP, the mainstream right Gaullist party, and the Front National. It was clear, even between Sarkozy and Jean-Marie Le Pen. Now, Les Républicains, the successor to the UMP, have factions within it which are pretty much identical to Marine Le Pen's party. You also, as a consequence, see more coalitions and collaborations with the radical right. Pretty much in a majority of EU countries, there have been alliances, coalitions between the mainstream and the radical right at either the national or the subnational level. And consequently, radical right policies no longer come exclusively from radical right parties. Sebastian Kurz, who until recently was the Prime Minister, Chancellor of Austria, was one of the first to argue that Europe should close its borders to African refugees, for example, even before the far right was there. Now, while mainstreaming is an empirical process where pretty much just the positions of the mainstream and the radical get closer to each other as pretty much a consequence of the mainstream radicalizing, normalization is a normative process. And we see that discursively in the way that mainstream politics, media, etc. talk about the people. When you see references to the people don't want this or they do want that, that people is almost always a specific subset. It tends to be white, conservative, nativist. And so it's the people don't like immigration. The people are worried about crime. The people are worried about Islam. Those are positions that don't only come from the radical right. You read it in any newspaper. In fact, these type of positions have become common sense. It's now common sense that multiculturalism has failed, that immigration is a danger, right? Even though these positions are actually radical right positions. And what we also see is that you see more and more open support of radical right parties and position by elites. Now, I mean, the best example is the Wall Street Journal opinion page that endorsed Bolsonaro, for example, in what was the 2019 election. But you also see authors, political scientists who pretty much defend white identity politics. You see academics who are on the list of far-right parties. You see columnists in major newspapers that support the far right. Even the Washington Post, for example, has at least one Trump supporter as a columnist. Now, all of this creates shifting boundaries. And so the late Klaus von Beimer wrote in 1988, we can't define them, but we know who they are. And with like they, he meant the far right. Now, I don't think that was ever true, but today it's even harder. Who is in, who is out, and what are the criteria? We even have increasing hybrid forms, which I call kind of national conservatism, or they call national conservatism. And where does the Conservative Party in Britain like end and the UKIP party start? Like, why is a party like the Progress Party in Norway in the category of the far right and traditionally the Republican Party not? Whereas the Republican Party is far more extreme even than various radical right parties in Europe. So we still work with a lot of classifications that come from the 1980s, 1990s. And I don't necessarily think that we should shift our understanding of what is and isn't far right. I think we should update our classifications. Now let me talk shortly about the case of Brazil. So in many ways, Brazil is a perfect example of the fourth wave. You see a complete mainstreaming of the far right in the form of Bolsonaro, who pretty much became the candidate of the mainstream right, and who is a blend of traditional conservatism and the far right. And in that sense, very similar to Trump initially, or to Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, people who come out of a conservative structure and who have aspects of the far right in their campaigning, and who are often perceived by the establishment as more conservative than far right. And that is the reason why they are supported. They're not supported because they're far right, but they're supported as the lesser evil. And you see, again, if I look at the Chilean runoff election, I see a lot of this discourse. Like, there are two evils, but like Cast won't be so radical. Like, this is what, of course, everyone thought about Bolsonaro too. Bolsonaro will just be a neoliberal, and like the rest will keep him in check. Exactly the same discourse as Trump, or as Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland. The fact of the matter is, over the last decade or so, like, all of these people have governed more like far right than as mainstream right. There's a normalization, I think, with Bolsonaro. As far as I can follow it, it has gone back a bit. But of course, Bolsonaro had a massive support from Brazilian media, mainstream establishment media, during his campaign. Several of these media empires are now rethinking whether that was a good move. But there's here a picture of Bolsonaro when he spoke at the World Economic Forum. Like the ultimate normalization. He was completely treated as a conservative politician who would make Brazil open to the world economy again. Even today, given everything he has done, he is still perceived as much less radical than, say, Marine Le Pen. Whereas objectively, like, the difference between the two is pretty small. Brazil is also a good example of this increased focus on so-called gender ideology. On the one hand, you do have some far right in Northern Europe that has kind of moderated on that, but you see actually within the largest part of the world, be that the US, Latin America, or Southern and Eastern Europe, that the focus has almost shifted a bit from immigration or integration to gender and sexuality. And the big threat, allegedly, to our societies and nations are now feminists and LGBTQ people. And that, of course, is also one of the ways in which the mainstream right and the far right find each other, particularly the religious right. And again, Brazil is a very good example of that. That coalition between the religious right and the far right. And then probably the most worrying aspect that we see over the last decade is we see a radicalization of the radical right. What I mean by that is that in the 1980s, 1990s, the borders between the radical right and the extreme right were pretty clear. You had neo-Nazi parties that were anti-democracy, they were marginal, and then you had radical right actors, and they didn't actually interact much. Today, we have radical right leaders or parties that openly flirt with anti-democratic measures. Like Trump, who speaks about the stolen election and pretty much overthrowing everything. Cast, who speaks, let's put it mildly, revisionistly about the Pinochet era. And then Bolsonaro has been openly flirting with military dictatorship, which obviously is extreme right. And what is most important about that is that in the 1980s, 1990s, there was kind of one rule of, or one law of the far right that almost everyone agreed with. And that was, when a radical right actor is openly extreme right, openly anti-Semitic, openly racist, or openly anti-democratic, they will not be successful. And clearly that is not the case anymore. Right? We have neo-Nazi parties in parliament in Slovakia and before in Greece, and we have people like Bolsonaro and Trump who have openly flirted with all these aspects and are still popular. But Brazil is also exceptional and even unique, and particularly unique in the sense that you have a far-right president without a far-right party. Obviously, he was elected on the basis of one party, then tried to create his own party, which was a disaster, and now recently joined another party, which, if I understand correctly, was his 8th party from his career. Traditionally, the radical right leaders come out of radical right parties. Increasingly, they come out of transformed conservative parties like Trump or Orban. But Bolsonaro is unique by being a far-right leader of a party that is A, not really his party, and B, not officially a far-right party. And I think the second, and I'm treading on a bit less solid ground here, but from everything I understand, Brazil doesn't actually have a real far-right infrastructure. Bolsonaro clearly was unable to build it and hasn't been able to profit from it. Rather, the infrastructure that Bolsonaro works with is, one, these kind of opportunistic mainstream parties, and then particularly the evangelical kind of Christian right infrastructure. But far-right parties, far-right publications beyond pro-Bolsonaro sources are still almost absent. And that could mean that if Bolsonaro is defeated, that by and large the far-right just falls back to nothing. It will build something, right? But there is no basis at the moment. Bolsonaro kind of floats. And the good thing about that, of course, is that as a consequence, he lacks institutional structure and support in things like Congress, but also at local and regional level. I mean, for that, you need an infrastructure like Trump does have with the Republican Party. So that's roughly it. I just wanted to mention that while my book has been translated in Portuguese for the Portuguese market, Eduer will publish a Brazilian edition of The Far Right Today next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mudde, for this enlightening presentation. Before we move on towards the questions here, I will try to group the questions around similar topics, and let's see whether Professor Mudde prefers picking each question at once, or if you prefer, I can mention several questions at the same time. But just a brief, more comment and remark. I slightly disagree with this perception that Bolsonaro has no proper social far-right basis. I think what may be crucial to understand the rise of Bolsonaro and his far-right politics without a party in Brazil is the fact that we have been under major shifts in our society, particularly in the religious arena. Of course, it might be too complicated to generalize anything about the evangelicals, but there is clearly a strong correlation between the growth of evangelicals in the population. And I'd say since mid-2000s, and it has become pretty much crystal clear after the 2014 parliament that was elected along with the re-election of President Rousseff that would be impeached less than 2 years later, that the Congress has become much more conservative in terms of gender views, terms of rights, and that is strongly correlated, to the best of my knowledge, with the rise of evangelical movements in the country. So just a potential research agenda for us here in Brazil, and of course, if Professor Mudde is interested to think about these evangelical and even conservative Catholics, I would say they like voting for Bolsonaro. Yeah.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah, of course.
Like Amy Erica Smith has done some really interesting work about the rise of the evangelical movement and kind of what that means for politics. And even though her book addresses the period before Bolsonaro, like it's very clear where that goes. I mean, I want to be clear, there is very clearly a social basis. Like what I'm talking about is an infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the infrastructure is a Christian right infrastructure, which has a lot in common with the far right, but is not the same as the far right. And potentially, like that Christian, that particularly evangelical, but not exclusively, Christian right infrastructure can take its politics away from Bolsonaro and into someone else who also supports that, but not other aspects of it, right? Just a very old school conservative could also take that. And so that is important. In a sense, Bolsonaro is dependent upon an infrastructure that he doesn't control. Right? They have things in common, but it's not his party, it's not his infrastructure. And that is very different from, if you think about Modi, for example, in India, who has a whole Hindutva infrastructure, which shares exactly the same ideology, or the Front National, which is an infrastructure which is their own. So I fully agree, and I do think actually that the role of, in general, the Christian right, with regard to the rise of the far right, should get far more attention, including here in the US, where the Christian right is almost written out of the importance, as if like the Christian right was the story of the 80s, 90s, right? And then we talked a bit about the Tea Party, and then we have the Trumpers, as if they're completely different people, but we see so many overlaps.
Yeah, thanks. And just a very minor remark. Of course, I don't want to monopolize here the conversation with Professor Mudde, but I see Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism trying to take over bits of what we consider here in Brazil the center right and even the right, because all parties, of course, Brazil's party system is a mess. We have more than 30 parties. So we also must contextualize that in the light of our complex and multi-party system. But I think Bolsonaro, he's taking over bits of parties as sections, and the Bolsonaristas, the supporters of Bolsonaro, they are pretty much likely to take parts of what we call here the centrão, the big center, that has often been portrayed as parties for sale, parties that would be aligned with the left or with the right without any ideology. But looking back, they have always leaned much more towards the right-wing values. They are the heirs of the military dictatorship or of the oligarchs who benefited from the military dictatorship. But this is just a minor remark in the light of our party system here. So let's go for the questions, beginning with Professor Dr. Davi Magalhães, who is a member of the Extreme Right Observatory here in Brazil. That's another initiative that is also interested in studying the far right in general here in Brazil and in comparative perspective. It comprises scholars from various universities. Dr. Magalhães, Davi, he teaches here at FAAP as well as at the Catholic University of São Paulo. And I will read it here. He sent me on the chat, on a private chat. In your book from 2007, Professor Mudde, you conceived the radical right, the far right, or better said, the radical right, based on three elements: populism, authoritarianism, and nativism. You derived this formulation from the parties that exist in Western Europe. Professor Magalhães wonders to what extent this model could be adapted to Latin America, given that in Latin America there is not much migration. On the other hand, in Latin America, as Professor Magalhães points out, there is a tradition of the caudillo, the leader, the personal leader with military characteristics. And I would add that comes from both the right and the left. And pretty much what Professor Magalhães intends to say and ask here, Professor Mudde, to what extent is this model based on Western Europe translatable to other contexts, like here in Latin America?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Now, it wasn't based necessarily on Western Europe, but more in Europe. I think it translates perfectly to the US. It translates perfectly to India, to Israel. I think Bolsonaro and to a certain extent Cas are different in the sense that nativism isn't the primary driver. It's definitely there and it's important. I mean, Bolsonaro clearly has a very white vision of Brazil and has let's say a classic white supremacy type of view where like white Brazilians are kind of the elite, and it doesn't mean that he wants to push out the rest, but the rest is welcome if they accept that kind of structure, right? At the same time, Bolsonaro did use immigration, particularly against Venezuelans, as Cas now uses immigration as well as and uses nativist language towards indigenous population, however small it is in Chile. And so I do believe that it is an important part, but it is not as central as it is to people like Trump or Le Pen. At the same time, the authoritarianism and the populism are the same. To be honest, I'm not fully convinced how well it works, in the sense that, to me, like, there are of course other right-wing populist leaders who are not specifically nativist. Think about Erdogan or think about Putin. And yet, when I look at Bolsonaro, I see more similarities with Marine Le Pen than I see with Putin. And so I maybe they're not the same, and maybe the European radical right is just one of the ways to look at Bolsonaro and Cas. Honestly, I'm struggling a little bit with that, because I've always put nativism at the core, right? And so when I talk about populist radical right parties, they are nativist first and populist second. And I don't think you can argue that for Bolsonaro or for Cas. And at the same time, I think for both, nativism is pretty important for the way they see the world, and to a certain extent, how they mobilize. Again, Brazil is so complex, particularly in terms, of course, of race. Like it is such a different interpretation of race than the US or Europe has. And the support base of Bolsonaro is much more diverse than the support base of Trump, for example. So I think that's a valuable argument. At the same time, I would be surprised if you wouldn't find a lot of similarities in who supports them, how they operate, how they govern, etc., etc.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Mudde. Other questions here somehow I think are already answered by your comment from Rodrigo Precalossi, who said, among the leaders who emerged over last decade, Bolsonaro, Trump, and Duterte in Philippines, which ones would you consider as populist, and would you include nativists in Europe? So Professor Mudde has already talked about Marine Le Pen. Rodrigo mentions here Wilders and the UKIP for Nigel Farage. So there is this overlap sometimes between nativism and populism. And as Professor Mudde said, he would consider first those some leaders in Europe as nativists and after populists, but those things would become blurred here.
Yeah, although I don't consider Duterte as far right.
No,
Duterte is not nativist, but he is populist, and
he's populist, yeah,
and authoritarian, yeah.
And others here, they asked similar questions, like Vinicius Vieira, not myself, but another person. Do you identify any elements in the Latin American radical right that distinguishes them from their European peers? So this is pretty much, I think, what Professor Mudde has just mentioned. But if you want...
again, perhaps I can add one thing. I mean, the past, the relationship to the past is a little bit more like Southern Europe. So I mean, traditionally, outside of Italy, like the radical right would use a strong separation from the fascist past. However, what you see in Greece, in Italy, and in Spain, and to some extent Portugal, is that the far right and the radical right does a bit the same as what you see with Bolsonaro and Cas. They don't. Well, Bolsonaro almost fully embraces it, but Cas doesn't. But he does have a revisionist view of the military dictatorship and kind of argues it wasn't real fascism and there were positive elements to it as well. And so there is a different relationship with the past and with, in a sense, anti-democracy. But I guess that is in part because it's not related to the Holocaust, right? I mean, to have revisionism about a regime that kills 6 million Jews is different than have revisionism for a regime that was a military dictatorship. And so I think that is different from much of how we studied initially the far right in Europe. Most of the scholarship in the 80s, 90s was incredibly was directed through the lens of National Socialism. And I think that's a very useless lens if you look at Latin American far right.
Yeah, moving towards another aspect, we still have here 6 minutes left, so I think there's time for one or two more questions. Eric Almeida Resende, she writes in Portuguese, I will translate to English. Whether you, Professor Mudde, could identify some core characteristics of right-wing populism in general regarding their international action, the foreign policy. Would they prefer multilateralism over bilateral arrangements among themselves? Would they be too personalistic in the style in which they conduct diplomacy, like Bolsonaro visiting Trump or making ties, building ties with Orban in Hungary? She wonders whether you could talk a little bit about that.
That's a good question about which there's immense speculation. Like, I mean, the media loves like the Populist International or like whatever it is. And the fact of the matter is that there is almost nothing, right? I mean, Trump has been in power for 4 years. During one period, like, what was it, about a majority of, or was it 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people in the world lived under right-wing populist governance. And except of a few meetings and some electoral shows between Modi and Trump and meetings between Bolsonaro and Trump and some others, nothing actually happened. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Trump had no vision for the broader world. But for Bolsonaro, it's also all instrumental. Like, he will be together with Netanyahu, but that's not about an international agenda. That's mostly signaling to his evangelical base at home, just as the Republicans do here. The fact of the matter is that they are united in what they don't like. Like, they're united in a dislike of, let's say, the liberal international order. And that applies less to Bolsonaro than to Trump or Le Pen anyway. Like, but they are often heavily divided about the role of the US, similarly the role of Russia, role of China. I think Bolsonaro has so far had a completely opportunistic foreign policy without any particular intention of changing the world order. And that's exactly the same for Trump. And so some of the smaller far-right parties have all kind of visions, but I mean, the international order is not made by countries like the Netherlands or Denmark, right? It's made by the US, Russia, and countries like those. And so far, they have done little. And in part, I think that is because Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi, they all govern a coalition that is pretty diverse in terms of foreign policy. It includes both kind of internationalists as the Christian right, the far right isolationists, but then also part of the business community that does want to have like parts of the liberal order up. So there is very little, and I don't think that there will be very, very much if Bolsonaro would miraculously be reelected and if Trump less miraculously would come back.
Okay, so just to wrap up, 2 very brief questions here. I'm summarizing as much as possible what was sent here on the chat. First, regarding the United States, do you believe, several people here asked me, do you believe that there is a possibility that Trumpism shall capture the great old party, the GOP, the Republicans, and turn the Republican Party into a radical right party? Is it already a radical right party? And apart from that, the context in which we live, namely the pandemic, our challenges coming from globalization. Do you think that populism shall survive what has happened after the pandemic? Once the pandemic is over, will there still be opportunities for not necessarily in Europe, but certainly here in Latin America, like Bolsonaro, Trump, leaders like that, to still have strong chances to either keep or reach power after the pandemic? So with this, we wrap up our discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I mean, Trump has already captured the GOP. He didn't even necessarily capture it. I mean, they surrendered without almost asking. My position is that the Republican Party was already radical right before Trump even won the primaries. But ever since, it is very clear that the radical right is governed. And weirdly enough, which I didn't see coming, it has actually become much stronger since losing in 2020. For example, we have here in Georgia a governor struggle coming up between the incumbent, who pretty much was one of the first Trumpian governors. And he ran his campaign with Georgians first, like an analogy to America first. But his major crime is that he ratified the electoral results and thereby made Trump lose, right? And so we now have a candidate who is challenging him and most probably will win, who pretty much is as far right in everything else, but on top of that has said that he would overturn the results pretty much if Trump wouldn't win, right? And so it's not just that they have become far right, like they've become extreme right. We have now more and more people who openly say that they will not recognize the results if their party loses. And sure, there are still conservatives there. There are still people who hate Trump, but either they're marginal or they're silent. And so they're irrelevant, right? At this point in time, the GOP is Trump's party. Now, with regard to the pandemic, populism in itself can combine with everything. And so any theme can be used for populism, and we see that, of course, when the far right is in power, it's more difficult to use populism for this. But in most countries, the far right is in opposition, and they have used the pandemic for a kind of an anti-authoritarian response, where they oppose pretty much all of the vaccine mandates or other types of things, and where they allegedly fight the authoritarian power grab by the mainstream, which uses the pandemic to undermine their rights, etc., etc. In the end, it isn't overly positive, because it does take away the attention from their key issues, which are immigration, integration, crime, partly corruption. So I think, honestly, still, if I look at what has happened over the last 2 years, pretty much, and polls, etc., I just don't see the pandemic have a fundamental consequence in terms of party politics. There's no indication, and there's really no reason, because for all of the disproportionate attention that we have for people who oppose masks and vaccines, the vast majority actually supports it almost everywhere. And even politicians who have really mishandled it, like objectively, like Bolsonaro, like AMLO in Mexico, or like Trump in the US, almost no one cares. AMLO is actually ridiculously popular and is making a complete mess of COVID. So I just don't see it doing either of the things. I don't think it will boost populism very strongly. It definitely also won't kill it. I mean, populism is here to stay for quite a while, as long as our politics remain relatively elitist, technocratic. We will have populist responses.
Okay, so thank you very much again, Professor Mudde. Thank you very much for having gone beyond the 1 hour that we had set initially. It's 1 hour and 3 minutes now. Thank you very much for the audience. In português, muito obrigado pela audiência. Thanks for your participation. Obrigado pelas perguntas, pela participação. And take a look at Professor Mudde's book, edition in Portuguese, that is forthcoming by Editora da UERJ, Universidade Estadual do Rio de Janeiro, State University of Rio de Janeiro. That shall be in the bookstores and online this February. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah, so on February, pay attention and please read the book. That certainly will be very enlightening for those who seek some direction in the study of populism, not just here in Brazil, but also in Latin America and around the world. Thank you very much again, Professor Mudde. Hopefully next time we meet, it will be in person. And as I told you on Twitter, we are neighbors to a football museum here in the Pacaembu neighborhood. The stadium hosted matches in the 1950, not the 2014, but 1950 World Cup. that will be a pleasure to welcome you in person here in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.